Guardo.
Dr. Warren and the Committee of Correspondence has sent us the warning. The British should be here soon.
This is Washington Crossing Historic Park in Washington Crossing, Pennsylvania. Now, George Washington made his historic crossing of the Delaware on Christmas evening, 1776. Several factors made it the perfect night to cross. Washington knew that the Hessian army camped out over in Trenton would consider Christmas to be an unlikely night for an attack. Furthermore, the weather was dreadful. So dreadful, in fact, that the Hessian sentries, whose job it was to keep an eye on the river, had been given the night off.
Let's review where we were in the war. Washington's first major battle was the Battle of Dorchester Heights in Boston. His strategy there had been brilliant, and he drove the British out of the city with their tail between their legs. That was in March 1776. In July, the Continental Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence. His next major encounter was Long Island in New York City, where he was driven out with his tail between his legs. The invading British army had chased Washington across New Jersey after the loss of New York. The news of this had an effect on the American colonists that was perhaps quite opposite of what you might expect. Instead of being outraged and resentful, a defeatist mood was spreading throughout the colonies. To make matters even worse, enlistments for most of Washington's men were set to expire on December 31st. With morale so low, he had no idea how many men might leave. Washington faced a fairly desperate situation, but it is in such dire circumstances where heroes are made and legends are created.
Time was not his friend, and a bold plan was needed. Washington had written the words "victory or death" on a piece of paper and left it on his desk. Such was the mindset of our future president.
Fortunately for Washington, the British Army had not pursued him as aggressively as they should have. Instead of the full British Army camping nearby, there were only about 1,200 conscripted Hessian soldiers keeping an eye on him from across the river. Washington had a 1-2 punch in mind: attack the Hessians in Trenton, then attack the British up the road in Princeton.
Now, what had saved Washington from being followed back across the Delaware after the retreat was the fact that he had gathered up virtually all the boats in this entire area. During the retreat, he had ordered that every single boat that could be located on the New Jersey side be taken as they retreated back to the Pennsylvania side of the Delaware.
That cold, wet, miserable evening of his attack, Washington managed to get 2,400 men, horses, and Henry Knox and his artillery across the broad, ice-clogged Delaware River. It was so miserable, Washington lost several men to hypothermia.
Now, just to sort of kind of give you a glimpse of the scope of that endeavor, without the 18th century technology and the bad weather, I thought I might drive across the Delaware. No, not on that safe, modern, useful bridge that we saw earlier. No, since this is drive-through history, I thought I would drive across the Delaware in a car. Or a boat, really. It's, well, kind of a bar, or a coat. I mean, it's a boat car. I'm the king of the world! This is the amphicar. A car that floats. Check out the twin screws. It's a little boat lingo for propeller. Oh!
The amphicar is designed to meet all your commuting and boating needs. For instance, how many times have you driven by a lake and said to yourself, if only I could drive across the lake and not have to go all the way around, I could save a ton of time. And hey, if I threw a fishing pole over the side, I might even catch dinner. And hey, if my wife was with me, she could water ski behind the car. Yes, the Amphicar was built to address just such practical needs. It was a car designed for, finger quotes, the future. Back in those heady days in the early 60s Cold War era when everyone wanted to be a secret agent. Eventually, the Amphicar company figured we'd all want floating and flying cars. And come to think of it, where is the flying car?
Now, the power plant of this bad boy is a 69 cubic inch Triumph engine. Cranks out about 43 horsepower. In other words, may have been pretty state-of-the-art for 1967, but it's just a skosh underpowered for today's standards.
The car and the boat steers with the front wheels.
How's this for cool? A bilge pump came standard on every Amphicar. Does your car have a bilge pump? Well, then I wouldn't laugh. They can come in mighty handy. Trust me.
The Amphicar will do 7 knots in the water and about 70 miles per hour on the road. Okay, here's an important question that's been plaguing serious historians for decades. If George Washington had an Amphicar, would he have used it on that epic crossing of the Delaware? For the rest of the story, we'll need to drive over to Trenton. Let's go.
In war, as in sports, momentum, or the Big Mo, is all important. After the Battle of New York, the British had it, and we didn't. Trenton changed all that, and if you analyze what happened, the question of character comes into play. George Washington was hardworking, brave, and sober. Colonel Johann Rall, his Hessian opponent, was hardworking and brave, but was known for having a drinking problem. Colonel Rall had distinguished himself at the Battle of New York, and British General Howe had placed him into a position of great trust here in Trenton, despite his character flaw. It's just coffee.
So bad judgment on the part of Howe and bad character on the part of Rall would contribute to the British loss in Trenton. It even cost Rall his life. There was an interesting side story that shows that the Americans apparently exploited Rall's drinking problem. Abraham Hunt, an unsung hero in the Battle of Trenton, was given the job of staying up half the night and having a party with Colonel Rall. Their heavy toasting and drinking left Colonel Rall in no position to fight when Washington arrived early in the morning of December 26, 1776.
After a brief skirmish at a Hessian outpost, Washington set up here, at a place now known as 5 Points, because it's the point at which 5 major streets converge here in Trenton. He ordered artillery to be set up here. Now, the Hessian army was asleep in houses along Warren and Broad Streets. Firing volleys of artillery down these streets prevented the Hessians from forming into lines and made them unable to effectively mobilize. Then the fighting broke out. It was the bloody, brutal, hand-to-hand with bayonet variety. It was all over in under 90 minutes. Colonel Rall was woken up from a drunken sleep by gunfire. He quickly realized that his only hope was to withdraw and try to regroup. He was shot from his horse right near this very location, what is now St. Mary's Cathedral. In fact, there's a plaque here commemorating the event. The Hessian army surrendered soon thereafter.
There were no American deaths that day. James Monroe, the future 5th President of the United States, was wounded near here in the battle.
On January 3rd, 1777, just 9 days after his bold attack on the Hessian regiments in the Battle of Trenton, General George Washington's Revolutionary Forces scored another strategic, significant victory against the British forces here at Princeton.
In another extraordinary and bold move, and under the cover of night, General Washington quietly led his 6,000-man army away from Lieutenant General Charles Cornwallis and his troops, who had assembled nearby for a battle that they planned to launch the next morning. Washington had left behind a small decoy detachment. About 500 Pennsylvania militia were given the job of acting like they were 6,000 men. They made large campfires and a lot of shoveling noises to disguise the the departure of the American soldiers and to fool Cornwallis into thinking that they were preparing for battle. Washington crept around Cornwallis in a large arc and then marched his army through the night over a back road toward Princeton until he reached the Quaker Bridge over Stony Brook, about a mile south of town. Then he split his army into two parts, the left wing under General Nathaniel Greene and the larger right wing under General John Sullivan. Washington had intended to attack Princeton before dawn, but he was behind schedule and the sun was rising.
Greene's assignment was to advance to the Princeton-Trenton Highway, stop its traffic, and destroy the bridge here at Stony Brook, while Sullivan's division, the main American attack force, moved toward the rear of the College of New Jersey, now Princeton University. Well, we made it to Princeton, New Jersey, in the Princeton Battlefield State Park, only about 10 miles or so north of Trenton. A quick little jaunt if you're in the Jeep, a bit of a haul if you're moving an entire army on foot. The leading brigade of Greene's wing consisted of about 1,200 men under the command of General Hugh Mercer of Virginia.
Now, before they even reached the highway that they were sent to secure, they ran smack into about 800 British soldiers under the command of Lieutenant Colonel James Mawhood.
Upon seeing the American force, Mawhood formed up his men across the edge of an orchard that was once here and waited for Mercer's troops to get within firing range. Mawhood launched a brave assault on the larger American force. The Americans were forced from the orchard and began to retreat in confusion.
During all the confusion, General Washington had arrived to rally Mercer's men and reinforce the battle with a fresh brigade of 2,100 troops. Washington rode straight into the British fire, personally leading the attack. As Washington charged toward the British lines, he was heard yelling, "Parade with me, my brave fellows, we will have them soon." Washington successfully rallied Mercer's men, and the larger American force was able to retake most of the orchard, until fire from Mawhood's guns stopped the American advance. In Trenton, General Cornwallis and his men had been aroused by the sounds of cannon fire coming from behind their position. Cornwallis knew he had been outfoxed by Washington and assembled his army to race to Princeton. However, Washington's rear guard had managed to further delay him by damaging the bridge over the Stony Brook. American snipers slowed his advance and caused further delays. The exhausted American army slipped away, marching to Somerset County Courthouse where they spent the night. When Cornwallis finally reached Princeton late in the day, he quickly determined that it made no sense to chase Washington, and instead abandoned many of his posts in New Jersey and ordered his army to retreat to New Brunswick to meet up with the British forces there. The battle at Trenton and Princeton greatly boosted the morale of the colonial troops, leading 8,000 new recruits to join the Continental Army. Public opinion about the war swung back in Washington's favor.
I'm here at this memorial honoring the American and British officers and soldiers who died here at the Battle of Princeton, whose bodies are buried near this site. Now, the twin victories helped Washington understand how to fight the war most effectively. He would avoid engaging the main body of the British Army and instead would attack smaller forces in outlying areas. This would prevent British control over a wide part of the territory, and it would also play to Washington's strengths. In a short amount of time, the British Army was confined to a small portion of the northeastern part of the state of New Jersey. This remarkable turnaround greatly increased the American morale.
From Princeton Battlefield State Park, it's a short 2-mile drive to the Princeton University campus, which is where we'll check out the story of founding father John Witherspoon.
John Witherspoon, who was born in Scotland in 1723, was a signer of the Declaration of Independence as a representative of New Jersey. He was also the 6th president of the College of New Jersey, what is now known as Princeton University. He was also a very influential and active Presbyterian minister. But one of the most important roles of his life was that of a teacher. In 1768, at the age of 45, John Witherspoon became the president and head professor of the then small Presbyterian College of New Jersey here in Princeton. He taught a number of courses, including history, divinity, and a required course in moral philosophy.
John Witherspoon was a staunch supporter of independence. In fact, he is featured in John Trumbull's famous painting of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Witherspoon served in the Continental Congress for most of the war, from June 1776 until November 1782. He became one of the most influential members and tirelessly served on over 100 committees.
John Witherspoon died in 1794 at the age of 71 years old. He's buried right here at Princeton Cemetery. Witherspoon was perhaps one of the most influential American teachers of all time. He produced 37 judges, 3 of whom went on to become Supreme Court justices. 10 of his former students were cabinet officers. 12 former Witherspoon students became members of the Continental Congress. 28 men sat on the Senate. 49 became United States congressmen. One former student, Aaron Burr, went on to become the 3rd Vice President of the United States, and another, James Madison, became president. John Witherspoon is a perfect example of the worldwide impact one good teacher can have.
Others buried here in Princeton Cemetery include Aaron Burr Sr., former Princeton president, one of the Presbyterian leaders of the Great Awakening, Aaron Burr Jr., the 3rd Vice President of the United States and the man that killed Alexander Hamilton in a duel, and U.S. President Grover Cleveland.
After his 2 victories at Trenton and Princeton, Washington brought his army here to Morristown, New Jersey. Now, Washington's first headquarters was located at Jacob Arnold's Tavern in the center of town, and later it was brought here to what is known as the Ford Mansion. Now, because the army camped here for 2 winters, Morristown is known as the military capital of the Revolution. Morristown was selected also because of its strategic location between Philadelphia and New York. It also has a number of natural resources and local industries that helped equip the army. Morristown National Historical Park consists of 3 sites: the Ford Mansion, Fort Nonsense, and Jockey Hollow. Jockey Hollow sits a few miles south of Morristown, once the site of the Continental Army's encampment. Fort Nonsense once occupied a high hilltop overlooking Morristown. Hold on a second.
The Ford Mansion, atop a beautiful hilltop in Morristown, was the site of the 1779 to 1780 headquarters of George Washington. That brutal winter remains the coldest on record for New Jersey and was the worst winter of the Revolutionary War. Some of the troops were actually starving. The situation was complicated by extreme inflation of money and lack of pay for the army. To paraphrase New Jersey founding father Thomas Paine, these were times that tried men's souls. During Washington's second stay in March 1780, he declared St. Patrick's Day a holiday to honor his many Irish troops. Martha Washington traveled from Virginia and was present with George each winter throughout the war.
Fort Nonsense was a term given to a fortification and an earthworks that General Washington had ordered built in order to protect his military and his supplies from British attack. Originally called Kitty's Hill, it was never really put to use in battle, and so the soldiers, being soldiers, who sometimes got cynical, assumed that Washington had ordered the fort built just to keep his men busy and out of trouble. However, it was quite common at the time for fortifications to be built in order to protect military encampments and strategic military depots. Did you guys see like a weird? One of the rooms here at the Ford Mansion that served a multiple purpose was this dining room. It's a dining room, but it also was where Washington met with his officers to plan his strategy and manage the war. As you can see, it's only a couple of hundred square feet, but this was the Pentagon of 1780.
In his farewell address, Washington warned the young nation to be cautious of foreign entanglements. He saw Europe as the source for potentially endless conflict and did not see it in America's interest to get involved. The modern Pentagon is 6.5 million square feet, 17 miles of hallways, and 6 zip codes. I'm not making a political statement here, just pointing out how much has changed.
Morristown played an important part in the Revolutionary War. It's a bit off the beaten path, but it's a beautiful community and well worth a visit. The Battle of Monmouth was a Revolutionary War battle fought right here on this battlefield on June 28, 1778. The main Continental Army under George Washington attacked the rear of the British Army's column, led by General Sir Henry Clinton. But perhaps the most enduring legend to come from this battle was that of Revolutionary heroine Molly Pitcher.
Molly Pitcher is the name given to a woman who attended the troops by carrying water for the soldiers in pitchers. Get the name connection? All during the very long, very hot day. Her husband was an artilleryman, and after he fell, either from a wound or heat stroke, Molly took over the duties of loading and firing the cannon. Like so many legends that have grown over the years, Molly Pitcher has become folklore, so it is difficult to know exactly what happened. We're not even exactly sure who the real Molly was. It was either Mary Ludwig Hayes Macaulay or Margaret Corbin. The Battle of Monmouth was distinguished for several other reasons. It was one of the largest engagements of the war, involving some 21,000 troops. And it was one of the longest days of fighting. The shooting started early in the morning and continued into the evening until both sides were exhausted.
Now imagine this scene. George Washington had spent the winter cooling his heels, literally, at Valley Forge. Baron von Steuben had drilled Washington's men into a professional military. And the British, who had been occupying Philadelphia, much to Washington's irritation, had decided to evacuate and were on the move across New Jersey. Their slow-moving wagon train of artillery and supplies was vulnerable and stretched out over 12 miles. Washington was in hot pursuit, and he was interested in doing some serious damage. Washington ordered General Charles Lee to attack the British at the rear, but when Lee got the opportunity, he lost his nerve and drew back to safety. When Washington came upon the retreat, he lost his composure. He challenged Lee's loyalty and his courage, and he sent him to the rear. He swore at him, according to one witness, quote, until the leaves shook on the trees. Washington then personally took over and rallied the men, proving once again that he was an exceptional field commander.
The Americans proved that they could take on the British in an open field 18th century style battle. Monmouth Battlefield State Park is one of New Jersey's best preserved battle sites. I love my job. And this series, which I call Columbus to the Constitution, has allowed me to tour 5 countries in Europe and most of the original 13 colonies in America. And now that my tour of early American history is over, I have to admit, I'm a little sad. In Europe, I got to explore massive castles, contemplate ancient tombstones, visit some breathtaking ancient cathedrals, and meditate about the giants of my faith. I visited tiny stone churches where oratories from humble pastors changed the world. I I got to drive some cool cars on the wrong side of the road, visit Sherwood Forest, and dance with gypsies. But it's America that will haunt my memories the most. I love my country, and I'm worried about its future. Have we lost our way? I think about Independence Hall and the courageous and honest men confronting tyranny who drew a line in the sand in 1776 and signed their own death warrants. Do such men exist today? And after fighting a long and difficult war, they managed to create the United States Constitution, a document that remains the envy of the world. This document speaks to every man because the cry for freedom beats in the heart of every human being. I pray for future leaders that have the honesty, courage, and perseverance of George Washington. We need the brilliance of Thomas Jefferson, common touch and common sense of Benjamin Franklin. We need men like John Adams, a disciplined and brilliant man who put the interests of the nation over his own special interests. Can America still produce moral leaders like this? Will we remain a free people? Maybe we just need a new revolutionary spirit. You can count me in. Thanks for joining me on this Drive Through History series. I'm Dave Stotts. Congregation, led by a fellow...
Wow, this place is so beautiful. It kind of makes your head spin.